The 1960s was one of the most trying and dynamic periods in the United States history. It was a decade of standing up and standing firm alongside others who shared the same desires and vision. It was a decade of actively protesting against the United States government and the way it functioned and treated its citizens. Many movements emerged throughout the 60s, in particular the Civil Rights Movement, which began in 1960 by the black community, who campaigned for equality politically, socially, and economically in white America. After the government slightly chipping at segregation with the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case in 1954 and the Civil Rights Act of 1957. The civil rights movement's strategies included marches, sit-ins, protests, demonstrations, and actions of trying to integrate the public educational system, all of which the black community did not want to engage in high amounts of violence. Within a few years into the 1960s, in the summer of 1964, under Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency, Congress passed Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 introduced a new era for the civil rights movement by creating the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and a community relations service to help local communities solve racial disputes, authorized federal intervention to ensure segregation was not practiced in schools, parks, pools, restaurants, hotels, and other public facilities, and restricted the use of literacy tests as a requirement for voter registration. Although this was a great beginning for the black community and their fight for equality, many whites nationwide were exasperated. Many whites were resentful, and tension between the black and white community grew. Years of fatal turbulence were underway. This resulted in extreme violence and damage to cities between the race groups, which we call race riots. These riots generally went off when a minority person was killed or injured, and other people of this minority group saw the act as unjust. These riots erupted in larger cities where there was a big population and concentration of minorities. The first major race riots were the Harlem Riots. These riots began on July 16, 1964, when a police officer killed a young black boy in Harlem, New York. The Congress of Racial Equality had already scheduled a peaceful march for 2 days later to protest police brutality. After the march, a more aggressive group of demonstrators took their protest to the police. Many fights broke out between the police and protesters, and 16 black demonstrators were arrested. Word of the arrest spread, as well as reports that the police was beating suspects terribly. This led to a crowd to gather at 10:30 p.m., and the riot began with protesters throwing bricks. The violence continued for 4 days and spread into areas like Brooklyn. Shooting and looting were omnipresent, and white businesses were burnt down. Core leader James Farmer unsuccessfully begged rioters to stop. The Harlem Riots ended on July 23rd with 1 death, 144 injuries, and 519 arrests. The Watts Riot began on August 11, 1965, with police using excessive force while arresting a black man in Watts, a black neighborhood in Los Angeles, for drunk driving. A small group gathered at the scene nonviolently. This changed when an officer accused the woman of spitting at him and tried to arrest her. The crowd immediately erupted and threw bottles and rocks at passing vehicles. More police were called to the scene, and the violence and fighting got worse. The police left the scene thinking it would end the violence, but the rioters went into the streets, damaging vehicles and burning and looting from businesses. The rioters burned 75 stores in the first 2 days. The police weren't strong enough to calm the situation, so the National Guard was called in. It took 13,000 guardmen to bring the riot under control. The riot ended with 34 deaths, 1,000 injuries, and 600 buildings were damaged, totaling $40 million in costs. The Newark riots began on July 12, 1967 in Newark, when police beat a black cab driver while trying to arrest him. A group of protesters gathered at the scene and became unruly. When asked to leave, they refused, and the police began to use force to break the group up. A protest rally against police brutality was called for the next morning, and just as before, police used excessive force. This caused the city to burst into violence, looting, burning, and shooting. The National Guard was called in, and in the end, 23 were killed and almost $11 million in damage were caused. There were many other riots that took place in the 1960s between 1964 and 1970, such as the Hue Riots, Philadelphia Riots in 1964, and the 1968 Chicago Riots. These riots during the 1960s were not the first or the last that the United States has been the battlefield for, but these riots were the result of a decade undergoing immense historical changes of the nation's infrastructure.